welcome to meeting number 65 of the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure, and Infrastructure. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 14th, 2023, the committee is meeting to discuss the role of McKinsey & Company in the creation and the beginnings of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. Members can attend in person in the room or remotely using the Zoom application.
I would like to, before welcoming our witnesses, inform committee members that the majority of our witnesses appearing before us, both in person and virtually, have completed their sound tests. We have one more that we are waiting on. I'll introduce the witnesses, and then I believe I'll turn it over to Dr. Lewis, who has a point of order. We'll begin with, from the Canada Infrastructure Bank, Aaron Corey, Chief Executive Officer, and Frédéric Duguay, General Counsel and Corporate Secretary. Bienvenue, welcome. From the Canadian Union of Public Employees, we have Diane Terrien, Senior Research Officer, joining us by video conference, and we are currently in the process of trying to connect Jennifer Carr from the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada by video conference. We hope to be able to do that shortly. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Lewis for remarks that she would like to share.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to take these few minutes to have the floor to address some preliminary committee business that pertains to this study. So I thank you for this opportunity to do so. The committee should have before them a notice of motion that should have been distributed to the entire committee. And while I respect that we have witnesses here before us today who can speak to the study, I believe that it's of critical importance for us to deal with the motion because it is central to this committee's work and the ability to adequately investigate this McKinsey connection to the Infrastructure Bank. Therefore, I would like to move the following motion, which has been circulated to the members of this committee. Pursuant to Standing Order 1081 and 2, in relation to the committee study examining the role of McKinsey & Company in the creation and the beginnings of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, CIB. A, summonses be served on Dominic Barton, past Global Managing Director of McKinsey & Company, Andrew Pickersgill, past Managing Partner of the Canadian practice of McKinsey & Company, Janice Fakasua, inaugural board chair of the CIB, Michael Sabia, past board chair of the CIB and past member of the Advisory Council on Economic Growth, Bruno Guillemette, past interim chief investment officer and board director of the CIB, and Tamara Vrooman, board chair of the CIB, requiring each of them to appear at the dates and times to be fixed by the chair by no later than May 11th, 2023. And the committee strongly urges Annie Ropar, past chief financial officer of the CIB, and the Honorable Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Infrastructure, to appear no later than May 11th, 2023. Now, after the Conservatives served this motion on Friday, this motion to compel the testimony, I understand that Ms. Vrooman has now accepted this committee's invitation to appear and that Andrew Pickersgill at McKinsey has requested that his McKinsey colleague, Rob Poulter, appear before him. I'm happy to amend the motion, Mr. Chair, to remove Ms. Vrooman's name, and we can also discuss whether we would like to remove Mr. Pickersgill if his colleague appears before him. Also, after Conservatives made it clear that they will, that these witnesses will answer to the committee, I understand that the current and former Liberal cabinet ministers and others at the Infrastructure Bank and McKinsey executives are also currently open to coming and checking their schedules. Let me say for the record, Mr. Chair, that until Conservatives gave notice of their intention to summons these key witnesses, we had a complete lockout of all the current and former board chairs, the directors of the Infrastructure Bank, including Mr. Michael Sabia, who is currently the Deputy Minister to the Finance Minister, Minister Chrystia Freeland. In essence, the people with key knowledge of this study about McKinsey's contracts at the bank were not participating. I also want to restate and reiterate that this committee agreed to study this issue unanimously. We consented to this study because of deep connections that McKinsey and Company has with the Canada Infrastructure Bank from its inception. We also recognize broader issues, including the reliance on external consultants by this government. The government also awarded $22 billion in contracts to outside consulting firms to do work which is clearly part of the public service's core responsibilities. Overall, these high-priced consultants cost Canadians $1,400 a year to every Canadian household. These decisions have led to a demoralized public service, and this has resulted in one of the largest public service strikes in Canada's history. The bank was created on the recommendation of the former McKinsey Global Managing Partner Dominic Barton. Thereafter, we know that contracts in the amount of $1.4 million, non-transparent contracts, sole source contracts, were awarded to McKinsey. Several McKinsey people were also hired at the bank, including the current CEO. This is a taxpayer-funded bank, and Canadians deserve answers of transparency. That is why I am frankly astonished that this committee has put out over a dozen invitations to key people who have worked for the Infrastructure Bank, who have served on its board, or who have been ministers of this bank, and we have not seen them respect those invitations to provide answers to Canadians. How we as a committee can complete this study and investigate the role of McKinsey in the creation and the beginning of the bank when those who were around at the time, who were directly involved, are refusing to come and testify at this committee. It is extremely disconcerting that these witnesses, most of whom are paid by taxpayers, are refusing to come. It is shocking that these taxpayer-funded witnesses are refusing to appear before a parliamentary committee to provide answers to Canadians with regards to the bank's business dealings with McKinsey. These are taxpayer-funded executive, board chairs, hired consultants who are paid six-figure salaries, who don't think that they even have to answer to a parliamentary committee. This is exactly why we have a problem with this bank. This committee studies shows why Canadians have a problem with this bank. The lack of transparency of this bank on contracts, on hiring, on salaries, on its project agreements, on its financing arrangements, and on providing accurate information to Parliament on the status of current projects is why we have a problem with this bank. All of these things are an affront to transparency. Canadians expect and deserve more from the institutions that they fund. We have and had already canceled one meeting because of this lack of cooperation, Mr. Chair. That canceled committee meeting cost taxpayers. We lost valuable time as a committee to do the work that Canadians expect us to do. Accountability starts at the top. Leaders are required to show up, especially leaders who earn six-figure salaries. Those whom Canadians elect and should be held to the highest standards. They earn more money than the average Canadian taxpayer who are paying their salaries. That is why it is even more disencouraging to members of this committee and as an elected member of this House to see that this unacceptable tone is coming from the top. Why is it that we have to strongly urge the current Minister of Infrastructure to show up and answer for his leadership on this bank? Why are all of the previous ministers on this file, which has been a revolving door of ministers, are not willing to answer questions about the government's flagship infrastructure policy and how it has been executed? It's clear they are afraid of transparency and they are afraid of the hard questions. If they have nothing to hide, they should come, and they should come willingly. Let me list the current and former elected officials who have not agreed to appear before this committee and answer questions on their ties with the Infrastructure Bank and McKinsey. Current Minister Dominic LeBlanc, no response. Former Minister Amarjeet Sohi, minister who brought in the Infrastructure Bank, declined. Former Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne, no response. I will say to her credit that the former minister, Catherine McKenna, has agreed to appear, and she is the exception in this entire group of Liberal cabinet ministers. But this utter disregard and lack of accountability is a trend that starts at the top. Furthermore, this lack of cooperation is an affront to the authority of this committee and an affront to Parliament. In closing, I sincerely hope that those whom we have invited to testify will come to committee because they have first-hand knowledge of the beginnings of the bank and its contracts with McKinsey. Unfortunately, at this point, we are already looking at canceling the next meeting of this study because of the lack of cooperation from this government and from this bank. We need key witnesses, former bank chairs, executives with both the bank, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, McKinsey, to cooperate to get to the bottom of this issue. But they do not, if they do not come voluntarily, it is fully within this committee's authority and entirely appropriate to adopt a motion to summons the key witnesses that will allow this committee to truly investigate the issues and to keep the publicly funded bank accountable. Those are my respectful submissions. I suspect that other members of this committee may also have something to say about my motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. I have two hands up. I have Ms. O'Connell, followed by Mr. Strahl. Ms. O'Connell, I'll turn the floor over to you, followed by you, Mr. Strahl.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, another day, another conspiracy theory by the Conservatives. I'm very pleased to be here on this committee today to see that the Conservatives have not lost their ability to invent scandals where one doesn't exist and to call this an affront to transparency. I would suggest it's an affront to reality. The fact is, while Dr. Lewis was speaking, talking about how there's a refusal of witnesses, a refusal to conduct this study, we have witnesses here, sitting here, ready to answer questions. But instead of answering those questions and talking about the infrastructure bank, the Conservatives would rather spend time creating clickbait, and probably will attempt to fundraise and make money on the clickbait that they would rather create rather than ask the questions of the witnesses sitting right here today. So the only affront that we have here today is to reality within the Conservative Party, because how can anybody suggest that there is not any transparency while you have witnesses here. Sorry, excuse me, I have the floor, and I'd appreciate. Excuse me,
and
I have the floor.
You came here deliberately to cause conflict. That is your role. That has always been your role.
Parliament.
This has been a peaceful committee until you intervene, and that is how you speak to your colleague. Get out of here.
You said
very eloquent.
You said
very eloquent. You're not going to bully us. You are not going to bully us. Canadians are going to hear from the witnesses, and we demand that.
Dr. Lewis, Ms. O'Connell had the floor. I think we can all respect each other. It's the standard practice here in this committee. Let's not bring what's occurring in other committees into this room.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's absolutely disrespectful to suggest that I, as a member of Parliament, can't sit here, and to come to this committee is to simply disrupt. Excuse me, I have every right to be here as anybody else. And if the member opposite, can't control herself, then I think we're going to have a very long day.
I just want to make it clear at the outset, we're not going to tolerate that in this meeting. When somebody is speaking, nobody else will speak.
Will she be admonished for telling you to get out of here?
Dr. Lewis, she did not speak when you spoke.
But will she be admonished for telling you to get out of here?
And I can tell you, based on her facial expressions, she did not appreciate what you said, but she did not interrupt you. And that's the kind of respect that I expect every member to show each other in this room. Thank you. Ms. O'Connell did not, and if you feel that you're being disrespected, please bring that to the chair, and I will take action to address it.
I'm bringing it to the chair right now. Chair, I was told as a member, as an elected official, to get out of here. I would like her admonished for telling me to get out of here.
If that happens again and you see that the chair has not taken action, then I will take action because I want to defend your right to speak in this room. It is your right, Dr. Lewis.
Yes.
But instead of doing that, you've decided to do exactly what you are now complaining about against Ms. O'Connell, and I'm not going to tolerate that in this room. When you speak, I will make sure that nobody else speaks when you speak. When Ms. O'Connell speaks, I will make sure she has the right to speak. That's the way we're going to work things in this room. So can we proceed? We have important work to do today. She has the floor. If you'd like to speak again, I will gladly put your name down after Mr. Stroll.
Mr. Chair, I'd like an opportunity to respond to you. Mr. Chair, I was elected by the residents of Haldimand, Norfolk, to be in this room to defend taxpayers, and another member told me, an elected official, to get out of here, saying that I don't have a place in this room. She came and she has disrespected not only Canadian taxpayers, but the entire residency of Haldimand, Norfolk, by telling an elected official to get out of the committee room. I was told to get out of here. I would like her admonished for that unparliamentary behavior before we proceed.
Dr. Lewis, if you heard those words coming out of her mouth, which I did not, your recourse is to call a point of order and say, Mr. Chair, this was said to me, and I would like the following action to be taken. That was not done. In the future, please bring that to my attention. You know that I highly respect you. I respect all members of this room. And I will make sure that everybody has the right to speak and nobody is insulted, and the constituents that they represent. So we will continue, and I will provide the floor to Ms. O'Connell, and I ask that everyone please respect one another during the proceedings of this meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks for the opportunity. I find the outburst absolutely insane to sit here and have to listen to the fact that I am questioned that for my presence here today, but then we hear an outburst about the comments that Dr. Lewis makes to me the second I respond to this motion. It's this constant silencing of opinions that differ from the Conservative Party. And that's what we are continuing to see. I won't be silenced, and the member opposite can make all of the fuss that she likes. That's not going to stop me from speaking my mind on the merits of this motion. And the fact is, the merits of this motion are ridiculous because we have witnesses sitting here right now. The member opposite referred to the Minister LeBlanc's apparent refusal to appear and or answer any questions. In fact, Mr. Chair, I sat here while it was Dr. Lewis who asked the minister if he would appear, or perhaps if it wasn't her, it was one of her colleagues, who asked the minister to appear at this very committee in which he was appearing. And he said he's, able to, except for the fact that he has no knowledge on the contract decisions made by McKinsey. So he would have nothing to offer the committee in respect to the information they were requesting. That's not saying he refuses to appear and refuses to answer questions. He's simply providing the committee with an opportunity to utilize their time with the most appropriate witnesses. I'm sure that Conservatives, when they were in power, remember how they treated committees and witnesses. And it's quite ironic to then say, when a minister rightly says the infrastructure bank is arm's length, he had no dealings with how contracts are decided, that you'd be better suited to invite other witnesses. Those other witnesses are sitting here right today. And instead of actually asking the questions of those appropriate witnesses, they decide to make a big fuss and create clickbait and create scandals where one doesn't exist. At what point, Mr. Chair, does they refuse to take yes for an answer? I understand we have 6 witnesses ready for next Tuesday. We have witnesses here today. We have additional witnesses that have been invited. The members opposite, to point out their own ridiculousness of this motion, were in live, as the motion's being read out into the record, the member opposite's making amendments to her own motion. That should demonstrate to Canadians how ridiculous this process is, how this is nothing more than an opportunity to divert time and attention that this committee should be spending on very real issues that Canadians are talking about, like climate change, resilient infrastructure. I don't know, perhaps the Conservative Party still doesn't believe climate change is real, and therefore they don't think the need of a study to talk about the resilient infrastructure that this government should be investing in. There's no merit to that. So instead, they decide to take on a study that, by the way, Mr. Chair, OGO has already studied. OGO actually heard from a variety of these very same witnesses and talked about the very same contracts. And so the members opposite could also just read the blues from OGO to get the very same testimony, but that's fine. All members agreed to take this on as well. The witnesses are lined up, more witnesses are invited, more are scheduled, but Conservatives instead want to create a fake scandal where one doesn't exist, suggesting that this committee is not fully prepared to listen and talk about these things and ask questions. But remember, this study is not about facts. It's not about reality for the Conservatives. It's about clickbait. It's about scandals where one doesn't exist, and they already have the information, and OGO already realized that there was no, what's the classic Atlantic saying, there's no juice or it's not worth the squeeze, and that's what we're seeing here, because OGO already moved on from it. OGO already studied it. OGO already realized that they got all the information they needed and moved on. But the Conservatives need additional clickbait, don't want to talk about climate change, don't want to talk about infrastructure that needs to be built in this country, don't want to talk about the things that I think most members want to talk about. So they want to recycle. The one thing they believe in climate change is recycling scandals that don't exist. And that's what we're seeing here today. So I think if we want to ask those questions, fine, witnesses are here. Let's redo the OGO study for all members who are interested. Let's take away time from talking about infrastructure or other transport issues to redo that OGO study with witnesses. Let's have the Conservatives create their clickbait instead of ask questions, because let's be honest, they're not really interested in the facts. Their minds are made up. So why ask questions of the witnesses that are here today? Instead, create that clickbait, create that scandal that doesn't exist, create, some fake outrage about, my comments and me being here and suggesting that I don't have a right to be here, that I'm only here just to disrupt. It's unfortunate that pointing out the hypocrisy in the Conservative Party and the Conservative members that equals they don't want me here. That's fine. I don't take it personally. I just see that whenever challenged with reality, the Conservatives are going to act in a way that they can no longer conduct themselves in a professional manner in this committee. So, Mr. Chair, I think that the best course forward is to continue with this meeting, allow the witnesses to answer very legitimate questions that the committee members may have, and allow the study to continue with, like I said, 6 witnesses next Tuesday. I'm assuming there are more that the clerk can probably even update us on, and leave the theatrics and the fake outrage of the Conservatives for their Twitter and Facebook followers.
Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. I'll turn the floor to Mr. Strahl, but before I do that, Madam Clerk, did you want to share the names of the members that are appearing, because it might help guide our discussions?
Okay, so for May 9, we will have Council of Canadians appearing, Honorable Catherine McKenna, Tamara Ruman, Toby Sanger, and I'm still waiting for our institute. However, Robert Palter from McKinsey Company will also appear on 11. And I still have heard about some others who are saying that they can't appear at the suggested date, but they will be willing to appear another date if we find so, such as Ms. Janice Fukakusa and probably Andrew Picker-Grill if it's if we want him to appear after Mr. Palter.
Clerk, Mr. Strahl, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And we've heard this. There's trying to create a scandal where one doesn't exist before. I recall hearing that before the SNC-Lavalin scandal. We were told to just shut our mouths and trust the government, and that everything was fine. And we know how that turned out. I do think there is a bit of gaslighting here, where where a member tells Conservatives that they're peddling, so that they're being silenced while saying that this is conspiracy theories. We're telling another female member of Parliament to stop making a fuss, referring to them being insane, the ridiculousness of this all, etc. This is, quite frankly, an attempt to shut down a legitimate motion that is in order, that was tabled before this committee as a result of, quite frankly, in the middle of last week, we had to cancel the Thursday meeting because no one would agree to come and participate in this study. Subsequent to that, Dr. Lewis wrote a letter to the chair and the clerk outlining our concern with that, raised the matter in the House, raised the matter by motion, and suddenly there was a lot of people that had said no that said yes. So forgive me, quite frankly, for just saying we should have just trusted the process and allowed it to go on, because we saw where that was leading. And quite frankly, I understand the Liberals don't want to go down this road and are going to oppose this motion. But this is the sort of thing that there'll be a time, I know they never believe it, there will be a time when they're on this side of the table and they will want parliamentary committees to be respected. They will want the supremacy of Parliament to be respected. They will expect ministers who are accountable, who are the responsible person for entities like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, to be accountable and to present themselves. We have a case where the governance website of the Canada Infrastructure Bank makes it very clear that the bank is accountable to Parliament through the Minister of Infrastructure. That is the accountability mechanism that parliamentarians have. And the minister, Minister LeBlanc, said he wouldn't come. at the committee the last time he was here, but he did say he'll make sure that the CEO appears. So he's already was talking about directing traffic, about, I guess it would have been good, maybe we could have called up the minister and he could have directed which of the other infrastructure bank witnesses appeared. But to have a minister of the Crown who is the responsible minister for the Canada Infrastructure Bank, he set the tone. He set the tone when he said, I will not come. And surprise, surprise, the other numerous other people affiliated with the bank said they too had nothing to add. So yes, the dynamics have changed dramatically since Dr. Lewis took action, since she moved her motion, and since she indicated that we would be bringing forward a motion to summons those witnesses who had declined without a reason. Now, a minister of the Crown has a complicated schedule. We understand that, but when the invitation is declined, that's not the same as I will see when I can make time. So, yes, we will acknowledge that there has been a shift in the witness list since Dr. Lewis took action. Had she not, we would be canceling additional meetings, as we are canceling a meeting on this study on Thursday. So, the Parliament. And I know this will fall on deaf ears on the Liberal side, but there is a time to recognize the precedent we are setting. And if we set a precedent where witnesses in a complicated study, in a tough study, who get called to talk about things they don't really want to talk about. Imagine if we had had our study following the debacle that was the Christmas travel season, and the airlines had said to this committee, pound sand, we're not coming. The outrage that would have been for all members of this committee would have been palpable. We would not have tolerated it. We would not have tolerated the airlines, the airports, and others that were responsible for that debacle for coming here to answer to Canadians. And to suddenly just say, well, now it's okay because this is something that the government does not wish to talk about, I think that sends a really chilling precedent, quite frankly, where the minister can come and say, I don't want to talk about it, and suddenly all of the people underneath him give the same answer. So the minister should be here. That shouldn't be in question. He might think he has nothing to add, but that's not up to him to make that determination. He's been invited. He's the minister responsible. We expect him to be here. Now, I know we can't compel the minister to come, but strongly urging him to come, I think, is the least that we can do. So I appreciate that Dr. Lewis's motion and her words in the House have gotten results, but we're not all the way there yet. So we need to move this motion. We can amend those who have already agreed, and we'll get to the questions today. We have a 2-hour meeting. Don't worry. But this is the sort of thing where Parliament has to stand up for itself because no one else will do it for this committee. If this committee doesn't stand up for itself and say, when we extend an invitation, you might not be available, but you don't get to just decline, especially when you are a part of an entity that is part of the government apparatus as the bank is. So we hope that we will get support to move forward with this because as the chair knows, this was a very, very bleak outlook here just a week ago. And yes, things have shifted, but that is not by accident. That is because of the actions that we've taken to assert our authority to signal to those witnesses that we intend to proceed with this study in a way that is beneficial to this committee and to all Canadians. So I'll be happy to support Dr. Lewis's motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strahl. Je vais passer la parole à Mr. Barcelou-Duval, suivi.
I'll give the floor to Mr. Barcelou-Duval to be followed by Mr. Batcrack and then Mr. Badaway. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Well, first of all, I'll take the opportunity to welcome our witnesses who are with us today, and I would like to be able to hear from them at some point, I hope soon. If we aren't able to hear from them, I hope that we will be able to invite them back another day. Now, on the motion tabled by Dr. Lewis, now, I'm certainly not a conspiracy theorist, but I also sent a list of witnesses to the clerk, and I also saw that the witnesses I requested basically all declined to appear, with one exception. So I'm disappointed, like my Conservative colleagues, and I would have really liked to see some of those witnesses appear, either last week or possibly next week. So I think that would really help us do the work we're supposed to do in this committee. So I think that's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate to see colleagues making interventions that are very, very long and that basically are using up a lot of the time of this committee meeting. This is very precious time that we could be using for other purposes. So I won't make a long speech here. What I'll just say briefly is that I would like to add something to Ms. Lewis's motion, which includes my witnesses. So if I could just make an amendment. Of course, I would need the support of my colleagues on this, but I would add the names of Annie Robert, the director of the Infrastructure Bank of Canada, to the list. And then I would also add I don't think he's on the list, but Steve Robbins, strategy lead of the Infrastructure Bank, and Anil Jaswal, strategic director at the Infrastructure Bank of Canada, and Bill Morneau, former finance minister. Those are the names that I would like to see added to Ms. Lewis's motion. And I hope that we'll be able to get back to work and be productive as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci.
Thank you.
Mr. Bachrach.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I do hope we can hear from our witnesses at some point today. With regard to the motion before us, I think the Conservatives make a decent point, which is that these witnesses were recalcitrant until this motion landed, and all of a sudden they've expressed a desire to accommodate the committee. So my concern is that if we don't support this motion, that recalcitrants will reappear and we won't see them at committee. I think we're doing a study on McKinsey's role at the Infrastructure Bank. Most of the folks on this list have been closely involved in the Infrastructure Bank, so I think their testimony is eminently relevant to the topic we're discussing. I also support my colleague from the bloc in wanting to add his witness to the list. But my bigger concern is that the committee has a pretty aggressive work schedule between now and Parliament rising for the summer. And I'm concerned that we've already litigated the Canada Infrastructure Bank once and issued a report. And I'll remind the committee that it was the NDP that brought forward the single recommendation that the bank be scrapped. So we're hardly doing the bidding of the Liberals on this one. But I'm just worried that this is the Infrastructure Committee. We should be dealing with issues related to infrastructure. The issue of procurement is currently being fairly thoroughly discussed at another committee that is focused on procurement. So I want to avoid, sort of this redundant fishing trip exercise that hasn't really proven to bear much fruit at the other committee, at least in my discussions with colleagues. That's their impressions. So I am curious to know more about the role of McKinsey in the bank. I think that's something that's relevant to Canadians, and for the reasons that I already mentioned, I will support the motion going forward, but I want to make sure that we put some sort of a cap on this study and that we don't jeopardize other studies, such as the investigation into high-frequency rail, which I think is going to be of interest to a lot of folks, also has tie-ins to the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And we have other studies, including Mr. Chahal's study on climate-resilient infrastructure that I believe will be interesting. So as long as we can hold the length of the study to the envisioned 4 meetings, we've already lost 1 meeting. And I would further suggest that if we run into a situation again where we don't have witnesses for a meeting, that instead of canceling it, we should proceed concurrently with one of the other studies. And perhaps that means that the chair might ask us to submit witnesses for those other studies so that we can have them in our back pocket and proceed as we have before in situations when witnesses haven't appeared. So I'll leave it at that. I do think there are outstanding questions. We've been highly critical of the role of high-priced consultants, particularly the impact it has on the public service. And I'm very keen to ask questions about McKinsey's role, but I want to make sure that we're not covering ground that is being covered more appropriately at OGO currently. So I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chair, and hand the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bacharach. I have Mr. Badaway followed by Ms. O'Connell, and just wanted to add to your point, Mr. Bacharach, or clarify. We actually have moved, because we knew we wouldn't have the witnesses for this Thursday. We have moved to begin the study of Mr. Chahal on sustainable and resilient infrastructure, and the clerk has done an exemplary job of trying to secure witnesses for that, and I think we're already at 3 or 4, and we're going to be picking up the phone to try and get more so that we don't lose, as you said, the important time of this committee.
Like, I only mentioned it 20 seconds ago. Our clerk is incredible.
Thorough discussions with Dr. Lewis over the weekend trying to make this work out. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Badaway, followed by Mr. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity. I guess the first thing I'll say is, and I appreciate the efforts that OGO had taken. They had 11 meetings, I believe, on this issue with a lot of content. I'm sure they gathered throughout those 11 meetings. Mr. McCauley from the Conservatives, as well as Barrett and Ms. Block, Ms. Kuzi, along with the Liberals and the NDP, a lot of credit for bringing a lot of the information forward. And I'm hoping, through you, Mr. Chairman, to the clerk, that we would have the opportunity to collect some of that information to actually complement what we're going to accrue over the next 3 meetings. But other than that, Mr. Chairman, my interest right now is for the 2 individuals that took their valuable time to come here today. So I'm hoping that we can deal with this motion and move on with the meeting so that we can hear from the 2 witnesses and be doing the work that we very well should be doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Final word from Ms. O'Connell, because I don't see any other hands up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to get some clarification then. If with this motion, as well as the witnesses that are already lined up, as well as the amendment that was moved, how many witnesses now are we required? Some rough math, I'm thinking we're at 18 or so that's being proposed and being asked of. Plus, you may have additional that are not actually on this list.
You mean the name in the motions and the amendment in total?
As well as, I believe, what Mr. Bassam-Duval had put forward, which is supported.
So in the 4 names added by Mr. Barcelo-Duval, there is actually 1 name was already involved in the motion of Ms. Lewis. So in total, it will be
Motion that I didn't know how many Mr.
just double checking.
Okay, thank you.
I think I have 11.
And then, thank you. And then how many, we have 6 more for next Tuesday.
I have actually 5 fully confirmed.
Okay. So, and then, so that's 15. Does that include how many, we have 2 here today. How many are on screen virtual? 2 or 1? 2 more? Okay. And then, so that's 19. And then there would be, if we're extending the names, then I would think that for equity, that the Liberals would also be able to put forward, and the NDP, if they have additional witnesses, would be able to put forward additional names. I would assume that that's the process in which committee operates in terms of inviting witnesses. So we're some rough math, 19. You have approximately 4 witnesses per meeting. So then taking into account that and the fact that on Thursday the availability wasn't there. So, and also taking into account that if we do have if the minister is re-invited, usually that is a standalone hour, whatnot. That's generally the practice. The committee can determine however they want. So let's take away maybe one or half a meeting for witnesses. So now you have approximately 20 to potentially 25, 30 more witnesses for a study that OGO has spent 12 meetings on. Does anybody know how many witnesses in those 12 meetings OGO called? Maybe not offhand, might not be a fair question, but I think that would be a good question to answer. So let's say we're at about 20 to 25 witnesses. We have 2, 4, 6, 8, maybe 8 committee meetings left. So I'm just trying to figure out if this is going to be the priority study of the committee, and with about 30 more witnesses potentially, 12 meetings at OGO. How, you know, if we're looking at having the same kind of spectrum that OGO had, 12 more meetings for this committee to study it. You know, and always taking into account taxpayers' value of committee work. So potentially 24 meetings on this, and we only have 8 more, potentially, maybe more, given timing and witness scheduling. So this study would essentially eat up potentially the remainder, with the exception of maybe Thursday, since there's already been another study confirmed, would potentially eat up the remainder of this committee of this session if all, because again, the motion is to summons these witnesses. It's not a request. So if that motion passes, we would be potentially, and then again, in fairness, adding on an appropriate number of Liberal witnesses that we'd put forward. We have the potential of eating up the rest of this committee time on this study. Is that a generally fair assessment, given those numbers? I just think the committee should understand. Right? 20 witnesses summoned, plus, give or take, plus Liberal witnesses for, like, fairness. 8 potentially. My math on the how many meetings, give or take, because I think we don't have a day for, there are 2 Fridays of committee time that's going to be eaten up for conventions. And then, so I don't know if resources will be redistributed for committees overall. So I'm saying 8 as a safe number, but, you know, give or take. So with this amount of witnesses, at 4 witnesses, roughly, minus half a meeting for a minister, if that should happen, usually half a meeting if there are officials. So that's a full meeting. This is the entirety of this committee schedule. I just think that's a fair thing to put on the table before we vote.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ms. O'Connell. I'll turn it over to Mr. Bachrach, and I just want to ask that we all consider whether or not this discussion will go on much longer, and if it does, out of respect for the witnesses, perhaps we let the witnesses go for the day. Just want to put that in the minds of members. It's not my decision to make, but I wanted to put that out there. Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do think that's something we should address. It's coming up to the top of the hour. My hope would be that we could proceed with testimony for the second hour. So my desire would be to vote on the motion and the amendment proposed by Mr. Barcelou-Duval. I'm going to hazard a second amendment, and I'll ask you, Mr. Chair, if it's in order at this time. But I would move that we amend the motion to include C, and that the study comprise a total of 4 meetings. This would require all parties to prioritize their witness lists, put forward their most important witnesses, and allow the committee to conclude its work on the study in a timely way. We've talked about a lot of very important topics at this committee and only allocated 4 or 5 meetings to those topics, and then concluded with a report. You know, there's huge swaths of Canada that lack passenger bus service, and yet how many days of witnesses did we hear from on that issue? 4? Yeah. So I just think it's a reasonable amount of time. We've already lost one meeting. We have witnesses here today. And my desire would be that we complete the study in a timely way. So I'll make that amendment and look forward to voting.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. So just for clarification, 4 meetings, would those be above and beyond the meeting we're having today, the meeting we've booked on Tuesday? And the second point would be, how many maximum will we have at each meeting? Because you can have 4 meetings with 10 witnesses at each meeting, or are we putting a cap, perhaps, for example, 4, 5, 6, which would give us a number of 24 or 18 total, or 20 total, excuse me.
I'm agnostic on the number of witnesses at meetings. My preference would be that we schedule as many as possible, and we have 2 panels of 3 to 5 witnesses per panel. We've done that in the past. I think we should act efficiently, try to get the information that Canadians deserve, and then move on to our other work.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I want to get to the witnesses as well, but on this procedurally, I just think, at Finance Committee, we used to have 6 or 7 witnesses per hour, and it's really difficult. You have witnesses there where they don't get a single question in a round, and so I'm proposing that perhaps, and I actually support the idea of capping the number of meetings, as well as then every party will have to prioritize witnesses, because if we're into the 30 witness range potentially, I do think there has to be a prioritization, and the committee's already agreed to do this study for 4 meetings, so I don't have a problem with that. It's the getting out of control, taking over committee business for a study that's already had 12 meetings on it. So I propose that we move this to a subcommittee meeting where members can determine the appropriateness of a procedural functioning of a 4-meeting. This is one and eats into it, but these are witnesses that were listed. And for the remainder 3 meetings, a prioritization in terms of, do you want 6 witnesses, knowing you probably won't be able to get questions to all of them. And then it allows us to move on with this meeting. And you can most appropriately, Mr. Chair, between yourself, the clerk, and representatives from all party, determine that prioritization of witnesses, as well as that fairness for each party to have their amount of witnesses in a fashion that actually makes the meetings have a point to it where you're going to have enough time to question every witness. So I would propose that you actually, because I think it's important, and that we work on that discussion at a subcommittee meeting where we can really iron out those details, and then we can move on with this meeting.
Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. Mr. Schroll.
Just briefly, I would note that the original motion called for at least 4 meetings. We envisioned that this might go longer. We did the same with Mr. Chahal's infrastructure adaptation meeting or study. We said that would be at least 4 meetings. We envisioned at the time that this may go might require a little bit more, which is why we worded it that way. So, and I would. If this was simply about a witness list, perhaps we could take it to subcommittee. This is about a summons, though. We are talking about summoning witnesses here, and I don't know that we can take that offline, because then that happens Thursday at best. We take time out of the Thursday meeting, and I just. I think the risk then becomes that we lose that Tuesday meeting if we don't deal with this now. It's 11:59. I'd like to give an hour to this panel, but I just raised those 2 points that we in the original motion we dealt with timing, and I worry that if we don't pass this now, we will end up in a similar spot where we don't have witnesses for a future meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Dr. Lewis.
Since this is a motion that I've put forth, I'm going to ask that if there are no other comments, that we proceed to voting on the motion.
Yes, Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the attempt to vote on the motion. We've actually had 2 amendments, so we'd actually have to deal with each amendment first. and we've been all speaking, to everything, but realistically, we should be speaking to one amendment at a time and then voting. So we can't actually shut down debate on a motion that has been amended 3 times, including by the mover herself.
Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. Okay, so what we'll do is I believe that the amendment put forward by Barcelou Duval, and I just conferred with the clerk on this, was a friendly amendment, and I believe it was even supported by Mr. Bachrach, so I think we don't have to deal with that one. We do, however, have to deal with the amendment proposed by Ms. O'Connell, which we'll deal with first, followed by the amendment proposed by Mr. Bachrach for 4 meetings.
I'd like to refine mine a little bit to reflect the conversation that we just had. If
Okay.
you welcome that, it might build some consensus based on the comments. So I believe that if we worded the amendment as the following, that the study comprise a total of 4 meetings, excluding the meeting on May 2nd, and with a maximum of 6 witnesses per meeting. I think that would address the concern that we've already eaten up a meeting and the concern that if we have 12 witnesses per meeting, we're not going to do them justice. So my hope is that we could come together around that. Move
Thank
on.
you, Mr. Bachrach. I'm looking around. I'm seeing some nodding heads. Ms. O'Connell?
Thank you. So while I appreciate the attempt to clarify, the excluding part is concerning because this is what we've already agreed to as a committee, which is the 4 meetings. That's going to change then. That's going to change, again, the makeup. I, would like to see exactly the amendments that the bloc has made in terms of those additional witnesses. There's no opportunity then clarified in this motion for the Liberals to put forward their appropriate witnesses. If we're just adding names on the floor, that's not really how committees put forward witnesses, keeping in mind that we always do it with a proportionality based on seats. So to leave this meeting here today without the opportunity for us to move forward with names is really not how things are done. That's why I suggested it go to subcommittee, and there's an opportunity to see all the list, all the priorities. I still think it's not realistic to have 20 to 30 people in, even if you want 4 meetings moving forward, you'll have panels where there are people who are summoned who will not have questions in a 1-hour panel. And what happens on days where there are witnesses available, but I think the clerk already spoke to some where the dates that witnesses were offered, they weren't available, but they were willing to appear. So now you're getting into a situation where how many meetings will this go into? Will you have panels of 6 people and a panel of 1 person if there isn't availability on a certain date? And I think making this substantive committee decision in terms of how a meeting will look based on witnesses, that's really the job of subcommittee to get into that, because there isn't an ability for the Liberals on the floor to bring forward names to respect proportionality of witnesses. And I don't think that that's how this committee should get into. It's one thing. The Conservatives moved a motion, but now we're adding amendments with adding additional names without the ability to then also do that ourselves, limiting it to another 4 meetings without the ability to have that discussion around how we would fit in that many witnesses in 4 meetings, I don't think is realistic. And so I was willing to move on with this meeting for the sake of the witnesses that are here now, but I'm not prepared to be rushed through a motion without us being able to put forward our witnesses and our perspectives on what functions well. So I'd like to discuss each amendment as they move forward. So right now I'm discussing the amendment by Mr. Bachrach, and I'm concerned that if we are moving to 4 excluding this, which is just wording, I think it should be for in addition to, but, I get it. We're making up motions here as we go. Again, there's no opportunity. Usually we'd have motions with additional witnesses must be provided by this date, that date. So I'm just concerned procedurally with how this is going. And so I'd like to speak to each amendment moving forward. I'll stop here. Like I said, I was prepared to move forward with these witnesses, but I also think that having witnesses here and drafting motions on the fly is why we don't do that, and that's why we have subcommittee to work at these details. But if members don't want to move in that direction, then I think we're going to have to get into the nitty-gritty, and that's going to take as much time as it's going to take.
Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. Mr. Backrack, did you have your hand up? So Mr. Backrack, suivi par Mr. Badaway, suivi par Mr.
Mr. Backrack, followed by Mr. Badaway.
That if we go to a subcommittee, we're going to eat up more time, and it's going to land back here anyway. So my desire, if it's at all possible, and maybe folks around the table can just tug their ear if they plan to talk out the clock, and if that's the case, then we can adjourn and go on to better things with our day. But the intention here is just to nail this down, empower the clerk to move forward with the administrative side of things, and then get to a place where we're actually asking witnesses questions. We've had lots of panels with, we have a 2-hour meeting, we have 3 witnesses per panel, that's 6 witnesses per meeting. Some of the witnesses don't get questions, but that's maybe because their testimony is either complete or doesn't prompt members to ask them any questions. I don't think that's the end of the world. And my desire to Ms. O'Connell's point about how witnesses are brought forward before parties have submitted lists to the clerk in order of priority, and the clerk has started at the top of the list and invited the witnesses. And we have a limited number of meetings, and so once all those spots are filled up, then that's the study. I think that's my desire, is to get to a point where we have some certainty around the length of the study. I think the wording of in addition to is more clear than the wording I proposed on the fly. I'm happy to accept that as a friendly-ish amendment, and as friendly as she gets. That's right. But my desire is to vote on this thing so that we can hear from Mr. Corey and Mr. Duguay, and hopefully have some testimony this meeting. 4 more meetings. Talk about the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Talk about McKinsey, and then put forward a report and move on to another topic.
Thank you, Mr. Backrack. Mr. Badaway, suivi par Mr. Basselduval.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a lot to think about. And I do have some concerns with respect to the direction that this is all going into, because there has to be a level of fairness here in terms of if we're going to start summoning people, that we all have that opportunity to do so, and of course really nail down that list that we might in fact be doing that with. So what I would ask, Mr. Chairman, is that maybe we can take a breath here and ask maybe for a 5 or 10 minute suspension, just so that we can discuss with our teams here what direction that we prefer to take.
Wait, sorry. Sorry, I want to control the mic. On that, could we get, is there a written copy of the witnesses that Mr. Basselduval have submitted? I didn't write them out, so I just want to know who they were. So perhaps we could have a break just to get those names so that we can actually discuss the contents of the amendments that were on the floor. I appreciate amendments can happen on the floor. I have no issue with that. But I would like to see those names and see what I'm actually voting on.
Colleagues, I think it might be a good idea for us to convene on the sidelines, try and work this out, perhaps avoid a lengthy discussion on this, and also a subcommittee meeting. So with that, I will adjourn for 10 minutes, and we'll hopefully come back to the table with something that we can all vote on and move on, possibly with the witnesses. Actually, that's a discussion. They're here for 2 hours. If we come back in 10 minutes, it'll be 12:20. At which point we can vote by 12:25. We would still have 35 minutes of witness testimony. Does it still make sense, colleagues?
They're here for 2 hours.
One clarification,
Yeah.
suspending, not adjourning.
We're suspending for 10 minutes. Okay, meeting is suspended for 10 minutes. So I believe there have been discussions, and we have come to some form of a consensus. Perhaps I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Bachrach, to read the revised version that we hope to be able to vote on.
So, Mr. Chair, the revised amendment is that the study comprise a total of 4 meetings in addition to the meeting on May 2nd, with a maximum of 6 witnesses per meeting. And the intention here would be that once we've set those parameters, we defer this discussion to a subcommittee meeting where the parties can discuss prioritization of witnesses and the precise list of witnesses that would be appearing at those meetings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Badaway. That's fine. Okay, we've all heard the revised amendment, so let's have a vote. All those in favor? All those opposed? The amendment carries. We can now move. Yes, Mr. Badaway.
Now, as part of that amendment, we're adjourning debate to go to a subcommittee meeting? That's not the motion? Okay, we'll go with that. So,
Procedurally, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Because this is an amendment, not a standalone motion, I think we have to deal with the other amendment and the main motion as amended.
Right. Yes. So he's moving that we adjourn debate on that to move to subcommittee.
right, so what I'm asking for, Mr. Chairman, is to adjourn debate so that we can go to subcommittee and follow the direction that Mr. Bachrach has already mentioned with respect to.
Yes, Mr. Bachrach.
An amendment by itself does not convey the will of the committee unless the motion it amends is also carried. And the clerk can correct me on that, but that's my understanding. So if we adjourn debate at this point, we have an amendment that's been carried, but we have nothing to attach it to, and therefore the terms of the amendment would not be binding on the committee. So my desire, and you know, I appreciate that we want to have the subcommittee meeting to hash out some of the business matters, but to the very first point that I made, it seems like the summons is also somewhat germane here because the witnesses have not proven cooperative in the absence of a summons. So I do think that it behooves us to deal with the Conservatives' main motion in order to get those witnesses queued up. Also acknowledging that their list of witnesses in the summons is quite long, and the amendment sets a limited number of meetings. So we might not hear from all the witnesses that get summoned. Some of them might get a thanks but no thanks message from us. So I don't think we can move to a subcommittee at this point and adjourn debate. I'll leave it at that. That's my impression of where we need to go.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Point of order from Ms. O'Connell.
Trying not to interrupt Mr. Bachrach in the interest of moving along. However, it's my understanding Mr. Badaway moved a motion to adjourn debate, referring the motion to subcommittee, and it's my understanding there's no debate on adjourning debate motion.
Yes, Mr. Bachrach.
That is correct, but he didn't move that as a motion. What I heard him say wasn't that part of my amendment that I had made, and it wasn't. So, okay.
Motion to adjourn debate, but
A motion
if
would
you'd like to.
It would be in order. I'm happy to vote on a motion to adjourn debate.
So the clerk just informed me it is not debatable to adjourn, so we'll entertain Mr. Badaway.
To the clerk, just for clarity, can I have a comment before I actually put the motion? Well, I know I can't do it after, but I'm just asking if I can do it before.
Can you clarify that a vote yes means we adjourn debate?
Yeah, so I would put that motion forward so we can carry on with motion, or Taylor's direction. I would put a motion forward to adjourn debate.
So a motion for adjourn the debate is non-debatable, so we have to vote on that kind of motions.
Okay, so let's vote. All those in favor? Recorded vote. All those in favor? Recorded vote. Go ahead, Madam Clerk.
So just to clarify, we vote on the motion to adjourn the debate. Yes. Okay, so I'm calling each of you. Mr. Badaway,
Yes.
Mr. Child,
Yes.
Mr. Iacono,
Yeah.
Miss O'Connell,
Yes.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Strahl,
No.
Mr. Lewis,
No.
Miss Lewis,
No.
Mr. Muse,
No?
Monsieur Barcelou Duval,
No.
Mr. Backrack, Six nays, 5 yes.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Clerk. So we have gone forward with Mr. Backrack's amendment. And now, are there any hands up for discussion before we move? Yeah, Ms. O'Connell?
Well, are we moving to the next amendment then?
The amendment was a friendly amendment.
Sorry? No, the
But
block.
The block amendment was a friendly amendment.
I'm sorry, with all due respect, Mr. Chair, there's no real such thing as
I know
friendly
there's no
amendment.
such thing. So if you'd like to speak to it, we can
And
definitely
no,
speak.
but could we first hear the amendment, the names again? Thank you.
Sure. La parole est à vous, Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
You have the floor, Mr. Barcelou Duval. So I wanted to add the names of Steve Robbins, Chief of Strategy for the Infrastructure Bank of Canada, Anil Jaswal, Director of Strategic Development, and Bill Morneau, former Minister of Finance. So those are the three names that I wanted added to the Conservative motion.
Merci, Monsieur Barcelou.
Thank you.
Any other questions, thoughts, concerns, Ms. O'Connell? Or no? Yes, Mr. Rogers.
Just trying to make some sense out of this in terms of the number of members that we are talking about bringing forward to the committee. And Mr. Backrack suggested, 3 per panel, whatever. So we're going to add more names to a list, what appears to be a long list. How do we determine priority for the list and proportional representation for each of the parties at the table? So, I'm not sure if this amendment makes a lot of sense when we're trying to restrict the actual number of people that we're trying to bring to the committee for 4 meetings. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Yes, Mr. Badaway.
Well, ultimately, that's the concern that I had, and hence the reason for the motion that I brought forward to end debate was because, the Conservatives have quite a lengthy list here. Trying to fit just those people alone into 4 meetings is going to be a challenge. And the reason why I wanted to bring it to business planning is to give all the parties the opportunity to look at some people that they would like to summon to come out within those 4 meetings. With the limited amount of time that Mr. Backrack has put forward in terms of his motion, and by the way, I might add his supported and passed motion, we should all, as per the usual practice of this committee, have that same opportunity that the Conservatives have now presented to us with respect to their wish to have these individuals summoned to come out to the meeting. Therefore, we, the Bloc, the NDP, should have that same opportunity. Hence, once again, I apologize for being repetitive, but hence, once again, for the business planning meeting, the subcommittee meeting, to establish that, so that everyone have fair opportunity to bring out members that they would like to summon, as the Conservatives have put forward now, full transparency, to then therefore have that same opportunity to bring out members that we may be interested in summoning ourselves. So, that's the problem that I have right now, is that if we move on to this motion, we're going to have these people being asked with no opportunity for the Bloc of the NDP or the Liberals to actually do the same thing. And I know we can do that at a future meeting, but it's very hard because we're going to be into the same debate we're into right now, wasting the time of witnesses that we should be listening to, which is like the irony behind all of this discussion. And therefore, we can just nail it down during a business planning session, which, by the way, wouldn't count as a meeting. It would just simply be a business planning session, that we can nail down everyone's wishes to have those summoned to come out to this meeting or to the one of the 4 meetings and be dealt with. Very simple. But now here we are, spending an hour and a half discussing an issue that could have been dealt with very simply by just simply adjourning debate, dealing with it at subcommittee, and then moving forward with the wishes of all parties in terms of the people that they, all of us, want to present to then be summoned to come out to the committee meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. I have Mr. Barcelou-Duval, suivi par Mr. Strahl, and Mr. Bachrach. Did you want to add your name to that list or no? No.
Absolutely.
Okay. Before I do that, it looks like this discussion may go on a little longer. I'm wondering if there's any objection for me to ask the witnesses to leave for the day out of courtesy. Seeing no objection, I'd like to take a minute to thank the witnesses who are joining us virtually, as well as our 2 witnesses in person today, for their time. We apologize that we were not able to ask the questions and hear your testimony. We hope to have you back at another point. But for now, unfortunately, we do have to continue with the discussion that we're having. And I thank you once again, and you're free to leave. Merci. Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval, you have the floor. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just have a quick comment to make about what was said. I'm just trying to understand the Liberals' reluctance about the motion, because it seems that there were a lot of points that they raised that were actually integrated here, particularly through Mr. Bachrach's amendment. And, you know, the motion doesn't actually list all of the witnesses. What it does is it has a list of people who would be summoned to appear. So those are 2 different things. All of the parties already had a chance to submit witnesses to the clerk. And I assume that, you know, with the clerk's work, they followed standard procedures for, you know, witnesses appearing before committees. So I don't think that more witnesses are being given to one party or another. We're just making sure that witnesses that have already been asked to appear but seemed to be uncooperative actually can appear before the committee so that the committee can do its work. Thanks, Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
A couple of things. I agree with Mr. Barcelou-Duval that these are not new witnesses that we have table dropped here today. These are witnesses that were submitted by the deadline to the clerk, and that who we received indication would not or had declined or ignored the request of this committee. So these are I would invite, as the Bloc Québécois has done. They also had witnesses, 3 witnesses here that they had on their list who had either ignored the request or declined it. They've added it. So we're not pulling these people off the street all of a sudden. The clerk has these witnesses. So I would encourage the Liberal side, if the clerk has witnesses, to add them to this motion. That is what we're talking about here. We're not talking about reopening the witness list. These witnesses that are in this motion, both from the Conservatives and the Bloc, were invited before the deadline and for one reason or another did not agree to appear. So that is the witnesses we're talking about. We're not talking about reopening the call for witnesses, as far as I'm aware. I would also indicate now that we have Mr. Bachrach's amendment has been accepted, that the date would need to change to May the 18th in the motion, in the 2 places that exists in Part A and Part B, just to if we're going with a meeting on infrastructure, climate adaptation for infrastructure on Thursday, we would then need, looking at the calendar, would need 4 meetings, would be by the 18th of May, as opposed to the 11th. So that amendment necessitates a change to our original motion. And I know we had indicated as well willingness to remove those individuals who have indicated that we would consider that amendment if the clerk has firm acceptance from witnesses that were on our original motion.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Yes, Mr. Chahal.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, I think some of these, with substantial changes made with the amendment, and some, my understanding, some witnesses were dropped today, from what I heard from our colleague, Monsieur Duval. So just to, from what our colleague, Mr. Strahl said, I think we do need an opportunity to review the witnesses and some of the conversations we've had today. But my concern is now we've gone into a lengthy debate and really wasted committee's time, and unfortunately had to send the folks testifying home. I wanted to hear from them today. That's why we had started this, and we could have done this, post meeting or through committee business. So the theatrics here it's extremely unfortunate that we've led down to a path of wasting our time at committee, not getting any work done, working on building consensus together, and that being completely disregarded. And I think that conversation, we have another report that we're working on and a study that we've been preparing for. I know the clerk has also been preparing to get witnesses. We've all been working on that in good faith by working together. So I think because there's a substantial change with the amendment that was made by Mr. Baccarat, that does also change things. New names were added, and we do need to have a conversation on the proportionality and the number of witnesses. I mean, with that, I have a number of other witnesses that I think we may be needing to look at as well. So I'd like, I guess for the record, could we get a clarification? There's been a lot of conversation going on, Mr. Chair, to start with, of who are all the witnesses that are being proposed or have been previously proposed through the study, who just so we can have a better idea of the parties and the witnesses' names that have been put forward, just so we can be clear. I got Monsieur Duval's witnesses. I wrote down, I believe there's 3 names, correct? If we could just get an accounting of the names of the witnesses and find out who, so we can make sure. And then I may have some other stat as well, or maybe not, depending on what the list is. To start with.
Thank you, Mr. Chahal. I guess you're looking for information right now. You'd like perhaps the clerk to read that off for you?
That would be preferable, just so everybody, all our colleagues, can have an opportunity to have a direct and clear understanding of who they are, where we're at, and Madam Clerk, if you could provide that to committee members.
Just to confirm, you need the entire witness list for this study, because it's like 39 names. That's the thing.
Yes, Mr. Baccarat.
I'm just worried that we're dealing with something that typically isn't public during a meeting. I have no trouble with the witness list being read out, but it just seems not germane to what we're talking about, because if Mr. Chair, if I may, if the Liberals have witnesses that they're having trouble getting cooperation from, they can add them to the summons list. But if there are other witnesses that are cooperative, they can be added to the list. We do a very informal and effective process with the clerk's help of getting witnesses to appear and organizing their schedules. And I don't see that. It just feels like now we're well into the area of just trying to delay the meeting and talk out the clock. And we have a motion in front of us. I'm sure the Liberals are going to vote against it. That's fine. But let's get on with voting.
Thank you, Mr. Baccarat. With regards to your point of whether or not we should be doing this in camera or not, is it the will of the committee to move in camera? Or do well, first I'd...
That.
Sure, go ahead, Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you. In reaction to Mr. Baccarat's point, it was actually Mr. Strahl who said that these witnesses were already, that the bloc have proposed, were already submitted, and that every party had the chance to submit, that they're only adding them to the summons list. However, we don't see who each party proposes. And that was the point of asking for all 30 witnesses, because if the suggestion is that they followed the process, followed the deadline, submitted their witnesses in time, and these 3 were already submitted, how do we know that? Because we don't see the list. So that was what is triggering the request. If you'd like to do it in a different format, that's fine. But I think that clarity is that Mr. Shaw put that on the record, that these witnesses were already pursued, but I don't know that, and I don't think other members of this committee know that.
Yeah, I'll go back to you, Mr. Bachrach.
Perhaps the clerk could simply confirm for Ms. O'Connell's edification that the witnesses that Mr. Barcelou Duval added to the summon list were part of the original invitation list.
Chair, I believe I also have the floor unless there's another point of order.
In order to be able to speak more freely about this and ensure we're able to dive into discussion about witnesses, can we move in camera? There's no objection to moving in camera?
We'll move back out at the appropriate time.
Oh, we'll move in camera. If it's the will of the committee to move back out in camera, we can do that as well.
On the motion to move in camera, if there is one, I don't see the point, because nothing that we're talking about should necessarily be shielded from the public. I think the public deserves to see how the committee tackles issues like this, and what we've proposed is entirely reasonable. The witnesses that Mr. Barcelou Duval added to the list, he's confirmed that they were part of the original invitation and that they haven't responded positively to the invitation. So I just think that we're at a point where, we can vote on the motion. It's very clear what the motion is. I don't want to move in camera just so that the decorum of the meeting can decline even further than it already has.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Rogers, followed by Mr. Chahal.
I had the floor, so.
Oh, sorry,
I
Mr.
don't mind.
Chahal.
I'll defer to Mr. Rogers, and then I'll come back. That's fine.
Okay. And then Mr. Radaway.
Actually, Mr. Chair, before we vote on any further motions, I'd like to see a written copy so we see exactly what we're voting on in both official languages.
Mr. Rogers, for clarification, you're asking for the amendments, the amended version of this, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
We should.
So, Mr. Rogers, the request has been made. We're just waiting on translation. So we're going to try and get that for you.
Just, Mr. Chair, that we suspend for a couple of minutes while we're waiting for that.
How long do you think it'll take? So, Mr. Rogers, we will move on to additional speakers. in an effort to save time, but we are adamantly working on your request. So we'll be able to get that for you hopefully as soon as possible before the end of the meeting. We'll turn the floor over to Mr. Chahal, and then I had Mr. Badaway, followed by Mr. Strahl.
Okay. Fighting with the mic. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I think it would be beneficial. I'm glad Mr. Rogers raised that because I would like to see what has been amended and changed. But just to go back to the point of that a list was provided, we've had substantial changes made in today's meeting. Number one, we had a motion drop on the floor to disrupt this meeting at the beginning of the meeting, where our two witnesses, we wasted an hour and a half of our two witnesses. They were sent home. So the Conservatives dropped a motion and spent a lengthy time on presenting it and then discussing it. We've also, Mr. Chair, and to the Madam Clerk, we also, I believe, Mr. Strahl had amended or changed some dates, I heard, and I just want to be clear that we captured that, and if at some point we could just make sure that, I believe it was the March 16th and 18th or the 18th date, which was going to be held, I believe, for the other study that we are doing, so that's going to impact the witnesses for that. I just want clarification if this study will, the date that Mr. Strahl had provided of the 18th, what will happen at that meeting, because it does impact the work of our next study if that's the new order. And then back to the list. It's unclear to me. It'd be nice to have the list provided previously, the list added today to see if there's any changes to that list. And I believe the clerk is working diligently to capture that information and make sure it's provided to all committee members. So we do have an understanding of the new individuals added, or if any changes have been made to respect proportionality, that all parties and members have the opportunity to do so. But Mr. Chair, I do want to note we did ask to go into committee business to have these conversations. We're not wasting committee's time. Fortunately, we've wasted a lot of time today and in previous committees discussing matters that are for committee business. And this committee has a process in place to go into committee business, to lay out and have these conversations. And I believe it's a waste of our time here as committee members not to be hearing the testimony of witnesses and getting into the details of the studies that are approved. And I'm extremely displeased with what's happened today at this meeting. And I hope we can work collaboratively through committee business and in future meetings to do the work of Parliament and through this very important committee and the future studies that we have in place that are extremely important from what we've seen with the impact on building resilient infrastructure across Canada. That's my focus for the next committee because we've all been impacted across the country. I know parts of the country are still out of power, and I want to get to that study as well because I think it's important for me and my constituents, but not wasting committee time on committee business. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chahal. Yes, Dr. Lewis.
I just want to state a point of clarification. The motion was not dropped today. It was brought on notice. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I have Mr. Badaway, Mr. Strahl, Ms. O'Connell, followed by Mr. Bachrach.
Can I make a point of order, Mr. Chair?
Always, Mr. Bachrach.
The subcommittee cannot deal with a motion to summon witnesses. Can someone clarify that? Can a subcommittee summon witnesses?
I'm going to confer with the clerk and we'll get
Awesome.
back to you shortly.
The same page because that was suggested.
While the clerk is confirming that information, was your hand up to be added to the speakers list or was it for that point of order? Sorry, was that to be added to the speakers list or for your point of order, Mr. Bachrach?
Oh, both.
Both, okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
All of the above and more.
So to confirm, Mr. Bachrach, before we turn the floor over to Mr. Badaway, no, it cannot be dealt with or adopted by subcommittee. It has to be adopted by the committee. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. Is it a point of order, Ms.
Yeah,
O'Connor?
it's just,
Okay.
can I get that same clarification in that subcommittees, though, can make recommendations that then committees adopt? So the discussion could actually happen at subcommittee, and then the motion or the proposal then be adopted at committee. I just want to make sure procedurally, if we're getting on the same page, that it can in fact be dealt with at subcommittee and adopted by the whole committee after, or ratified would be the right term.
Yes, I'll turn it over to clerk for greater clarification.
So this motion, it can adopt a motion and represent by your report to the main committee. The motion will need to be adopted by the main committee. Usually it's a report by the main committee, and the discussion could happen by the committee. But this is present.
Merci, Madame la Greffière. I'll turn the floor over to you, Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Bacharach's correct, partially, in terms of the discussion at a subcommittee. However, as the clerk has stated, anything that happens at subcommittee has to be ratified at committee, period. So with that said, and that was my whole point of bringing it to subcommittee, so we don't burn meetings. Now, when this motion was brought forward, and in fairness to all parties around this table, including the presenters of the motion, it gives us all the opportunity to look at our list that we submitted to the clerk and revisit those lists to see who we would otherwise summon to this meeting. The motion that I brought up earlier, and it goes to Mr. Bacharach's point, which I think is valid. We just passed a motion by you, sir, that limits us to 4 meetings. So when are we going to have that discussion, in fairness to all the parties, to be able to divvy up the time within those 4 meetings for the people that we all may want to summon? We asked 11 witnesses to come out. Only 1 came out. We would like to revisit that and possibly summon one of those 10 to come out. That's fair. You may want to do the same. The block may want to do the same. So with that, the fairness here is to go into a subcommittee meeting to within that 4-meeting time slot to give everyone the opportunity to actually put a list forward to summon. If we pass this motion now, we won't have that opportunity. That's all we're asking for, is to simply go into a business planning session, a subcommittee. Like I'm looking at the list right now, and I see names on here that I would love to summon to come out. Patrick Brown, the mayor of Renton, didn't even respond. I would love to be able to summon someone like that out.
I think he would be a wonderful witness.
So my point is that all we're asking for with this motion is to have the same opportunity to populate those 4 meetings with some of our witnesses that we may want to summon. Why can't we have that opportunity? If we pass this and we have to come back to this at the next meeting, we're probably going to burn, as you said, another meeting. I don't want to do that. I want to get back. I want to get to work here. So with that said, and while the Conservatives sit on the other side and laugh at this whole process, we're taking it seriously. And with that said, can we hear the laughter across the side, Mr. Chair? It's actually comical. You know, we're talking about earlier on about respect. You know, it's unfortunate. Did you want the floor, Mrs. Stroll? Did you want the floor?
Eventually.
Okay, well, then put your hand up.
I'm already on the list.
Perfect. So that's all we're asking for, Mr. Chair. So with that said, again, it's unfortunate that this committee can't look at respecting all the parties to actually have the same opportunity that's being proposed in this motion. That's simple. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. And now, lo and behold, Mr. Strahl has the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Isn't that convenient? Mr. Chair, this motion has been on notice for several days. Dr. Lewis gave notice in advance of even moving the motion to the clerk and the chair that she was upset and was considering doing this based on the what was happening with the invitations. So the Liberal Party has had ample time to consider an amendment to this motion, as the Bloc did. Mr. Badaway keeps referring to the Bloc hasn't had time. They've done it. They've given us their list of 3 individuals that they believe should be added to the summons list, and that has been will be accepted at the appropriate time. So I do know we are 5 minutes from the end of this meeting. But Mr. Chair, I don't know if this will affect your future planning, but the expectation is that this will be the business of the committee until it is disposed of. So I can inform you as a courtesy that this will be the first item of business at the Thursday meeting, because we are not prepared to just let this continue to go on. We have a motion that could have been dealt with an hour ago, that the parties on this side of the table all were prepared to deal with. And so, we can talk out the clock here, as has apparently been the agenda from the Liberal side, but it will be brought forward again on Thursday, where we will continue to debate this until such time as we have a final vote. So perhaps they will be prepared with their list at that time. That's fine. But this will not go, we will not proceed with normal committee business with a motion on the floor. The expectation will be that we will either move this motion again or that we will deal with it on Thursday at 11 o'clock.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. I have Ms. O'Connell, followed by Mr. Backrack, followed by Mr. Barcelou-Duval, followed by Mr. Badaway. Ms. O'Connell, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, we just heard it. We just heard the not-so-veiled threats by the Conservatives that they want to hold up the work of this committee until they get their way on this motion. Until they get what they want, they won't let this committee move forward on anything else. It's out there on the record what we've been saying. How many times did we say we want the witnesses to remain to ask questions? We all came prepared with questions for the witnesses. They sat here for nearly 2 hours. The members opposite could have moved this motion at the end of the meeting. We moved amendments, just to summarize, we moved amendments to actually move this debate to subcommittee that would then report back to this committee with recommendations dealing with all of this. I spoke to that amendment talking about how we could get satisfaction through working through these details in terms of number of witnesses, proportionality for parties. And I said, then if we move this to subcommittee, we get those issues addressed that we have, that concerns we have, we can move on with witnesses. But no, the Conservatives don't accept that. It's our way or no way. And that's not how committee works. That's not how Parliament works. Dr. Lewis talked about the residents that sent her here. Well, guess what? Residents sent us here too. And we have every bit of a right to speak and say we want additional witnesses for this study. The suggestion was made that the witnesses being proposed, the amendments to this motion being proposed were on the original list. We have no idea of knowing that. Mr. Badaway rightly pointed out that there's a difference when every committee, I've sat on a lot of committees, that every committee, every party submits their witness list. Sometimes witnesses aren't available. Sometimes they don't want to appear. The clerk moves on, tries to keep it as proportional as possible, moves on in booking and scheduling those lists. And what we have here is a very different process, because this is now demanding witnesses appear, demanding when they appear, and in doing so, it's not the normal process. Therefore, every party needs that proportionality to be able to submit their same demands of a list. Mr. Badaway pointed out Patrick Brown. He'd be an excellent witness for this study. I really hope that he's available. And, I think the fact, again, that we don't actually understand whose witnesses were proposed previously versus whose are now being demanded to appear. We don't know that proportionality because it's an entirely different process that the committee utilizes, and that's why it requires a separate motion. If this was the normal course of business of how committees invite witnesses, then we wouldn't be spending 2 hours debating a motion. There was every opportunity to do this at subcommittee to work at these details to make sure everybody was comfortable. But again, the Conservatives' my way or no way has prevailed. We had to let witnesses go that were here and ready to testify, which I thought is what they want for Canadians. So, Mr. Chair, in lieu of all of that, I'm going to once again try to attempt on our side to move forward. So I'm going to move an amendment, and then I'll speak to the amendment itself after. So, Mr. Chair, I move that prior to the adoption of the motion and the associated summons being issued, the subcommittee be convened to discuss the scheduling of meetings, the construction of panels for the study, and to report back to the committee with the results of that conversation, and that to add Mr. Patrick Brown, Mayor of Brampton, to the list of summons.
Thank you very much, Mrs. O'Connell. We will now start a new list to address the amendment put forward. We'll start off with you, Mr. Badaway.
Well, and just to go to that motion, Mr. Chair, and again, go back to my point that I've been making all meeting, is the fact of, with the lists that the Conservatives have put forward, the amendment that Mr. Barcelo-Duval has put forward, if in fact Mr. Bachrach is going to put something forward, whether it be today or in future meetings, and of course our desire, who queues up within that 4-meeting time frame? So who queues up? Where does the preference go? Because you only have 4 meetings. You only have so much time, 6 per meeting. So who queues up? And that's my point, is that we need a meeting to identify within those 4 meetings, as per Mr. Bachrach's motion, who in fact would fit into those time slots. And again, it's about fairness. We have a list here from the Conservatives. Great, okay. So now we have a list from Mr. Barcelo-Duval. Okay. That takes the time slots from those meetings. And of course, we're going to come forward with a list. So who queues up? Who's the priority? And hence the reason for the request for a business planning session, for a subcommittee meeting. And whether it's in camera or not is not my concern. Bottom line, however, is that we have to establish the fairness on who's going to be brought forward, and with that, who's going to queue up in priority. There's only so many minutes, hours in a meeting. And who's going to occupy those meetings with respect to those names that are going to be brought forward by all the parties. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, it is 1:02. So I'm going to, if there's no objection, adjourn the meeting. And we'll see you all back here on Thursday. Merci tout le monde. Thank you.